Okay, I think we're good to make a start. So, first of all, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us this evening and sharing this time with us. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which Melbourne Central resides. We acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and Melbourne Central rests on the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people, part of the Kulin Nation. And I would also just like to acknowledge Māori as a tangata whenua, the people of the land of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we respect their continuing connection to culture, land, waterways, community and whānau. Now, I would like to thank you, Professor Henry Wu and Dr. Owen Bradfield, for joining us tonight to talk about this hot topic of AI and transcription tools. So Dr. Owen Bradfield is the Chief Medical Officer of the Medical Indemnity Protection Society, or MIPS, a doctor and health lawyer who has 15 years experience in the medical insurance field, and he has advised and represented doctors in a range of medico-legal disputes, including civil claims, regulatory complaints, employment disputes, coronial inquests and Medicare investigations. He also sits on the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Ethics Committee. And we also have Professor Henry Wu, who is an academic urological surgeon specialising in prostate disease. He is the head of Department of Urology at the Blacktown and Mount Druitt Hospitals in Sydney, as well as the director of the Uro-Oncology at Chris O'Brien Lifehouse. He's also the board of director of the Australasian Urological Foundation and the Australian and New Zealand Urogenital and Prostate Cancer Trials Group. He has extensive record of publications and serves on the editorial boards of numerous international journals. So thank you both for coming and joining us tonight. I will just pass off to you guys.
All right. Good evening, all. I think that I've been given the task of starting off, and I'm going to give a short presentation on, I guess, the use of AI in surgical practice from a surgeon's perspective, and then we'll hear the truth come from Owen Bradfield shortly afterwards. So I'm just going to share my screen and all right, hopefully that should be on view for everybody now. All right, I'm going to start off with my disclosures, if I can get this. There we go. I'm actually a subscriber to Heidi Health, which is one of the AI Scribe software programs. I pay an annual subscription of $799 per annum. And as a subscriber, I have the potential to make some money from the platform if I so chose to do so, and get up between $10 and $40 per free each sign up, depending on whether it's a free or paid sign up. To date, I have earned nothing, and it's probably because I'm not working hard enough in getting my referral link out there. Now, for years we've been talking about, AI is going to happen in surgery, and a lot of it's just been blue sky stuff where we're saying, oh, AI is going to start doing the lymph node dissection for me during a robotic surgery, and I'll just sit back and have a cup of coffee while it all happens. But the thing is that, in an almost insidious manner, AI has actually become very much part of our world, and in particular with AI Scribe software. And it's actually here, right now. So those of you who are Fatboy Slim fans will know that know this, of course. So how is it right here, right now? Well, these scribe programs can be used to summarize. They basically listen in on the, I guess, the conversation between a surgeon and their patient, and they summarize that. They can summarize that clinical encounter. Now, from that listening in, it can also create output, and you can choose to create letters, have the program create letters which go back to the referring doctor, or refer letters to other specialists, and even the program will actually prompt you on the basis of your discussion and say, hey, did you want us to write a referral letter to the radiation oncologist? And you just click a button and it will happen. It also can create patient reports, which might be for insurance companies or for patients who just simply want a summary to have on hand. And it can also print out, produce patient information sheets. Another thing which I find particularly interesting, and I've been using it quite a lot, is a process called smart dictation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There's also slightly different software programs available, which are commercially available right now. And these programs are used in education. So you might go to a conference and, I guess the legalities of recording the lecture is another matter, but I won't go into that here. But it can listen in on the lecture and basically summarize the lecture or presentation. And for your own education, it can create study notes and can also even create test questions or a quiz so you can test your knowledge on whether you've actually managed to retain anything from that educational exercise. So these are two groups of software, AI-driven software that is available right here, right now. And to give you an idea of just how this space is evolving, we have these are 6 of the major players in this area, and there probably are others that I just don't know about. And looking online, I could see that there are probably getting close to 20 to 30 different types of scribe programs, although not all of them are tailored towards medical use. Now, as I mentioned before, Heidi is the one which I use, and it's highly customizable. So you can set it up, in a number of ways. For example, before I start, I set it up so it gives me this box here, because I want this box as a reminder that I've got to get the patient's consent. Because what's actually happening is that when the software is listening to your consultation, it's actually recording it. So in order to, I have a very conservative, you could say, interpretation of recording laws in New South Wales, which is where I reside, and know that I must, by law, get the patient's permission. So in order to, be sure of that, I actually make sure that this program gives me this prompt. And once I've got that prompt, or once I've got the patient's permission, then I click that box, and then it enables me, the box which says start recording becomes functional. Now, the other thing which I do, and there's some conjecture about this, is that I actually tell the patient that I delete the recording from the Heidi software, so that once I've got my information or the summary of the discussion implanted into Genie, which Genie is the software, medical practice software that I use, then I personally see there's no use for the transcript, so I delete it from there, and the patients find that reassuring that there is no other record lying in some server, which could be in the United States or India or Pakistan, who knows where. And that's something which I've found extremely difficult to ascertain from looking at the fine print from all of these AI scribe companies. They don't tell you where their servers are located. And also they don't tell you how they handle that information. So with an abundance of caution, I delete it from them, and they have no further record of that. Now, this is just shows you how, shows you the interface you get with Heidi, and it's all pretty much the same with all of these programs. And you can see here that I've already had a discussion with a patient for, say, 23 minutes. So the consultation's already occurred. So I'll just show you what happens when I will click for this to stop recording. And when that happens, you can see that it starts interpreting the conversation, and it starts spitting out this text here. Now, this is highly customizable, and I've set it out in a traditional SOAP format. So you can see it's got down the subjective, objective, and assessment of plan. And it's amazing how I've been amazed how accurate it is. And the other thing is that with it being AI, it actually learns as it goes, and it starts learning your acronyms that you use, and it starts associating certain things, with certain discussions with certain outputs. For example, if it's hears me talking about an elevated PSA and further investigations being necessary, then it'll start making comments like, oh, we may consider an MRI scan of the prostate, which is obviously what we would as urologists do. So I don't even have to mention that. And because the AI program has learned that that is a common pathway that I use, it'll actually do that for me. Now, I'll just move on to the next one. Now, here is, an example of the transcript, and obviously there's too much to read, but it's amazing how, how accurate it is. It's pretty good at, getting most of what what you're talking about. You can see even extraneous stuff like, yeah, I can hear you loud and clear, etc., etc. And that's something you see with traditional scribe programs, which simply record everything that's said. But most of those things like the drag and dictate, they're not AI driven programs. They just simply transcribe everything's written, including stuff that you don't want to appear in the text. Now, after when you've got that copy of that transcription, there are various outputs that you can choose. For example, I've got custom ones here where on this here you can see Zoom review means that when I've done telehealth consultation, then that's going to produce an output that's associated with that. So typically the content will have that I reviewed such and such a patient through a video telehealth consultation today. Whereas with a review, where I've seen a patient in my clinic at Lifehouse, it'll have I reviewed so-and-so who was seen in my prostate clinic at the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse today. So that's all, that's a standard, start to the letters that come out of that. And you can see there's, you can have things like referral letters and medical certificates, carer certificates, etc., etc. And if you're too lazy to create your own templates, in fact, you can go onto the website and it'll have user uploaded templates, which are free for anybody to use. So I even noticed there was a urologist, a very well-known urologist, David Keynes in the United States, who I actually know personally, who's done a lot of work in creating templates. And I'm actually tempted to use his because it saves, he's a urologist and he does what I do. So it saves me the effort of having to produce my own specific templates. Okay, now, when you've got, this is the note which goes into my clinical records, but let's say I want to do a Zoom review, which means I want to create the letter that comes out of it. And here's how it spits out. Now, during that conversation, I made no mention of the name of the GP. So what does the AI program do? It just makes it up. So it decided, okay, the GP is going to be Dr. John Smith at 123 Main Street, Sydney. No harm done, but that's fine. And in this particular consultation, usually I don't make any mention of the name of the patient at all either. And what it does is that it just makes it up. So I decided that for this consultation, my patient's name is going to be Mark. And as you can see, it already made up the name of the GP, but that's fine. And it's, again, the letter that's spat out is customizable. And this is the way I've set it up to be a fairly to-the-point type of letter. I've sort of one of these people who believe that GPs don't want to see a 3-page letter. The type of letter they see from the neurologist was, what they do anyway is they go to the very last paragraph and that's all they read. Okay. Now, this is something which I really like is a smart dictation. So you've got a choice between smart dictation or word-for-word dictation. When you use word-for-word dictation, that's just like using drag and dictate. But with the smart dictation, it's fantastic. When I just want to say write a very specific type of report, which is difficult to customize, in the program. I just dictate it, and let's say you're in the process of dictating, and you say, "Oh, look, you know, I want Jim to have an MRI scan." Oh, no, no, bugger it. No, I want him to have a PSMA PET scan. And the software, being smart, will know, oh, he's stuffed up there. What he meant to say was he wanted a PSMA PET scan, and it will ignore the crap I wrote, or the rubbish I said about having an MRI scan. So it's amazing how it gives you it'll give you the dictated, I guess, text that you wanted to have rather than what you actually said. And I found that a particularly useful tool, and I use that quite a lot. So that's been, in fact, you can almost argue that if you're a little bit coy about AI listening on your conversations, you can just simply use the smart dictation tool. I think it's infinitely superior to what you get with the word-for-word dictation with, say, drag and dictate and similar. And also, it's a lot cheaper too. So this is so you might have seen at the very beginning when I had the consent to record this session. But you can actually, instead of clicking transcribe, you can click dictate, and that would take you to that menu. Well, when it comes to AI, it's that it's a case of where it's out here right now, and it's a case of whether you are prepared to make the jump. And I guess that I'm probably one of the earlier adopters, and I did make the jump, and I have no regrets. I might now hand over to Owen Bradfield, who will tell you a bit of truth about what's involved with using AI in surgical practice.
Thanks very much, Professor Wu. Not sure about the truth. I think perhaps a different perspective, but I have to reflect. I always find it incredibly powerful just to see these transcription tools in action. Every time I present one of these talks on AI scribes, I get to see, a different perspective on how they work. And in this case, in surgical practice, I think there's a different nuance. So I'm just going to share my screen. Like Piper did at the beginning, I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands upon which we're all gathered this evening across Australia, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are in attendance. Just, I guess it's hard to escape a presentation from a lawyer without there being a disclaimer, so I won't disappoint. Just a reminder that this is general information, it's not specific legal advice. So, if you do have specific advice that you want in relation to your own use of AI scribes, then get in touch with your own MDO for further information that will take into account your specific circumstances. So I guess just recapping what Henry's already mentioned. So essentially, the key things to understand in how AI scribes work then flow on to some of the important medico-legal considerations to think about. So first of all, there's an audio recording that then generates a transcript, which then is used as a basis to generate a record or some other document, as we've seen Professor Wu highlight. So whether it might be in some context a discharge summary or a referral letter, or a sick certificate, carer certificate, and so forth. As Professor Wu's also mentioned, many of these tools work slightly differently. So, some store transcripts, some store audio recordings for different periods of time. Some don't make it clear whether they do, and if so, if they do make it clear that they store information, where is it in Australia, is it overseas? There's all these sorts of questions which I'll come to. And also in some circumstances, some of these software developers have created tools that actually redact transcripts. So it hears, when it's recording, it hears a name or a place, or perhaps it's some other identifying piece of information, and redacts that from the written transcript. And that can be important later on when we think about some of the legal issues that may arise. I think it's really important as well to talk about the benefits as well, and just to echo what Professor Wu's already mentioned. There is, research that these are here and now. There's increasing, and very fast uptake of these tools in clinical practice across the specialties, but particularly in primary care. Um, uh, and, I think they're a real game changer. So in medical defense, I guess we have this kind of axiom that good records are a good defense, bad records are a bad defense, and no records are no defense. And all too often, when I'm looking at records in the defense of a claim, sometimes the records don't always quite give enough information to be able to kind of understand what might have transpired during a consultation. And I think these tools are a real game changer because they are the resulting record, as we've seen demonstrated. They're very detailed. They can be very accurate, although you have to check that, as I'll talk about. And they're generated virtually in real time. So it does sort of eliminate, recall bias or doing all of your notes at the end of a session or at the end of a clinic, and then sort of struggling to remember exactly what happened. So they have the potential to be able to record more and better information. And medical records are so essential. They're an essential part of the patient's clinical journey, and ensuring that, if other practitioners are involved in a patient's care, that they can go back and have a look at a shared record and understand the nature of the care that their colleagues have previously provided. And so with that, they also play an important part in patient safety. And as I've also touched on, in the defense of claims, if claims or complaints do arise in the future. We know from surveys, particularly in the US, that the creation and maintenance of medical records is a real pain point for practitioners, many of whom, say that they're often spending more time, again, particularly in primary care, spending more times documenting than with patients. And surveys following the introduction of some of these tools indicate that they can improve productivity, and that some clinicians are able to see up to 40% more patients. So, I guess it means you can be more productive. You can either see more patients or spend more time face to face with the patients that you've booked in, and sort of truly understand all of their problems, and the records are being generated at the same time that you're seeing the patient. And with that comes increased or improved work satisfaction. So that's what a lot of the research shows us. There are, however, some important medico-legal considerations, and I think it's really important from the outset to say very clearly that none of these medico-legal issues are reasons not to use AI scribes. So my role here isn't to say that you should or shouldn't use them, but I think to say that if you're going to use them, to go in informed and to know exactly what the scribe does, to understand by having a conversation with the software vendor exactly what it's designed to do, and then to trial it for yourself. And often these vendors will allow you to trial their programs before you sign up and subscribe. So it gives you an opportunity to just test it out. How does it work? Is it intuitive? And that means that you can try a couple of them and see which one works best for you in your particular clinical situation. But essentially, consent is probably the most important issue, as well as privacy and data retention. But I'll also talk briefly about some of these other issues as well, including how they're regulated, thinking about content and accuracy, and what the medical board and other codes of conduct think about these tools. So the first and most important issue to think about is surveillance devices legislation. And, as is often the case, unfortunately, in a federation like Australia, we have different laws across the country, and surveillance devices laws are one of many examples where there is disharmony between the states and territories. So in the states and territories highlighted in red, it's a criminal offence to record a conversation without the consent of a party to that conversation. And a conversation includes a clinical consultation. So there was actually a case a couple of years ago where a patient surreptitiously recorded a consultation with their GP in New South Wales, and the GP found out about that and reported it to the police, and the patient was subsequently found guilty of breaching the surveillance devices legislation in New South Wales. And so there's no reason to think that the contrary situation couldn't arise, that if a clinician recorded a consultation without the patient's consent, that they wouldn't also be at risk of a criminal offence for having breached surveillance devices legislation. So I think my first kind of key message is the importance of getting consent. And even in those jurisdictions like Victoria, Northern Territory, and Queensland, where there isn't that requirement to obtain consent from the patient, it's still certainly an expectation of the Medical Board of Australia, and they've very recently published some guidelines around the use of AI, where they're very clear that where the use of AI requires input from the patient, that you have to get consent from the patient and talk about the use of the use of their data and what will happen with it. But also the other important consideration is, what about telehealth? So, for those surgeons out there who may be working in more remote parts of Australia, you may find yourself working in an area where you consult with patients by telehealth across state or territory borders. And so you just have to be very clear about what laws may apply. And so in a telehealth situation, even if you're physically located in a state where it's not a requirement for you to get consent from the patient to not breach these surveillance devices legislation in your state, there may well be different laws across the border. So I think just in terms of universal precautions, obtaining consent is not only the right thing to do legally in most states, but also the right thing to do morally and ethically across the country. So just to reinforce that point, to avoid criminal sanctions, get consent. And in terms of what you need to do, I think in very broad terms, the patient needs to understand that the consultation will be recorded. That's really all they need to know in terms of protecting yourself from potential criminal allegations. But in terms of your obligations under privacy and information health records legislation, it's important also to explain to patients in more detail, what will happen to the information. So that's where it's important to understand where data will be stored, for how long, and when or if it's deleted at some point in the future. And I'll get to that shortly. The other common question that we're asked is whether you have to get consent before every consultation. And so just thinking about the previous slide, so uh, uh, any consultation that's recorded without consent is likely to be a separate offence. So therefore, it's important to get consent before every consultation that's recorded. But what that means in reality is that probably the consent process would be very detailed the first time that you see the patient. And then following subsequent consultations, you can probably just remind the patient that, you'll be recording it again. Do they have any questions about that? And I guess just being probably more led by the patient, any questions that they have. Generally, people's experience, clinicians' experience who are using this, is that most patients don't voice any concerns, but it is still important to just remember that they do need to be aware that every consultation will be recorded. And so, the other question we often get on our advisory service is, well, what if the patient refuses to consent to the use of an AI scribe? Well, it just means you can't use the AI scribe, but it doesn't mean you can't see the patient. So you would just prepare your notes as you would do normally. It sounds obvious, but it's a common question that we're often asked. So the next issue I wanted to canvass, I've talked about the need for consent and surveillance devices legislation. The second issue is in relation to data retention. And so the reason this is important is because thinking back to my first slide about the steps in the process of creating a record through AI, is that the consultation's recorded and then transcribed. And then that transcription forms the basis of a summarized medical record. And so using Professor Wu's example, he's using a piece of software that generates a transcript, and then that transcript generates a record that is then entered into Genie, another piece of software. And so Professor Wu's records are held in Genie. And so many of you would be aware that there are legal obligations in some states and territories in Australia that mean that you have to retain health information for a minimum time period. And so in New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT, you have to retain health information for at least 7 years after a patient was last seen, if they were an adult, or in the case of a child, until the child reaches the age of 25. And so what that means is that you're not going to delete your Genie records in relation to those patients prior to the expiry of those timeframes. But then the important question is, well, what happens to those transcripts? And that's a really important question to think about, because the law requires that health information be retained for a certain period of time. It doesn't talk about medical records. So the question that needs to be asked is, uh, if the transcript is being deleted before this statutory time period, then am I satisfied that the information that's in the medical record is complete? Or is there potentially health information that's still in the transcript that hasn't found its way into the medical record? And so if health information is in the transcript and that transcript is deleted often within 24 hours or 7 days for many of these software companies, then that could potentially be in breach of the law in relation to retention of medical records in these states. Now, it's a very complicated legal question, because what some of the software vendors will say is that those transcripts are de-identified. So there's no identifiable information in those transcripts, which means, therefore, by definition, they're not health information, which means they can be deleted at any time. So it's really complicated. It's going to depend on what information you're given by the software vendor about what they do with those transcripts. It's also going to depend on what is in those transcripts. So if there's identifying information in those transcripts that hasn't found its way into the medical record, then deleting it before the expiry of these time limits in those states may be unlawful. But that's a question that you'll need to get specific advice on, and it's really about understanding from the software developers what their terms of use are. In all the other states, so outside Victoria, ACT, and New South Wales, the Commonwealth Privacy Act applies, and that's a little bit more straightforward, because the Privacy Act in those states, or as applies in those states, says that health information or personal information can be deleted once it's no longer required. So once you've generated your medical record or generated a referral letter or a certificate, and you no longer need that transcript, then in those other jurisdictions, it's likely that that transcript can just be deleted because it's no longer required. So it is a very complicated issue. And I think really the purpose of this is not for you to have a detailed understanding of what your legal obligations are in each jurisdiction, but to flag it as an issue that is important to, first of all, for you to understand, but secondly, to have a conversation with the software developers before subscribing, or if you have already subscribed and you're not sure what happens to information, then it may be an opportunity to engage with the software vendor and have that conversation and find out for yourself. And if it raises any questions, to speak to your MDO. So just to summarize then, the important questions to ask is what information is retained by the software provider? Are voice recordings or transcripts or both held by them? And if so, where? So where are their servers located? If they're located in Australia, that usually isn't a problem. But if they're located outside of Australia, then there may be additional obligations under the Privacy Act or other privacy legislation that you may have to be aware of. And generally, it involves ensuring that the overseas jurisdiction has laws that are very similar to the Privacy Act and can ensure the privacy and confidentiality of patients' information. And that patients are aware of those overseas data flows and can consent. So the next issue I've talked about, I've talked about the need for consent and surveillance devices laws. I've talked about data and data retention, all very complicated issues. The next issue to think about is accuracy. So none of these tools are 100% accurate, and Professor Wu's demonstrated how sometimes errors or known errors can find their way into transcripts. So where there's no name dictated, it'll make it up. So Professor Wu's aware of that and obviously corrects that prior to sending out letters. And these tools are getting better very, very quickly. So when they were first introduced a year ago, they had an error rate. I'm sure you'll find that error rate is lower now just because of the increasing use and uptake of these tools and the fact that with every use they learn. So with time, they get better and more accurate. But it is important to understand that you as the clinician ultimately bear the responsibility for ensuring and checking the accuracy of the generated record. And I don't think that's a problem at all, because I think it's time consuming to check the accuracy, but it's still quicker than having to start from scratch and generate the record yourself. But also, I think human input into an AI generated output gives a better result than each individually. So a human trying to create it or just relying on AI alone isn't as good as when there's human oversight over an AI output. So I think accuracy is really, really important, and again reflected in very recent Medical Board of Australia codes and guidelines. There are also a couple of other kind of issues to think about. I don't think these are particularly likely to arise in the context of AI scribes, because I think just the fact that they are so much more detailed, they're created in real time, it's unlikely that records generated wouldn't comply with some of the legal obligations that exist around the creation of records. But I think it's just important just to go back to first principles and think about what information has to be in a record for it to comply with different pieces of legislation. So in this first case, we've got the health insurance regulations, which essentially is what Medicare will look at if your clinical practice is ever audited by Medicare. So if Medicare ever looks at your Medicare billings and has questions about the clinical appropriateness of your Medicare billings, one of the first things that they'll do is look at your records for evidence to substantiate those billings. And what they will do is look at whether your records meet the requirements for being adequate and contemporaneous. And so they have to clearly identify a patient. There has to be a separate entry for each time the patient's consulted. They have to be able to be understood by another practitioner. And then each entry has to have a date, provide enough clinical information so that somebody else can take over the patient's treatment, and be completed at the time the service was provided or as close to thereafter as possible. And so again, the fact that there's so much detail in there that the transcript is uploaded into an electronic health record that already sets this information out in a template anyway, and that it's generated in real time, means the risk of falling foul of these obligations are minimal. But I think it's just really important to stop, remind ourselves about these obligations, and just to ensure that we're satisfied that the software is ensuring that we're complying with these obligations, really just because there are so many more and more of these vendors out there now, and as I'll get to shortly, they're not TGA regulated, at least not at the moment. So it's just important to understand that you're across your own compliance requirements for your own practice sort of risk mitigation. I'll skip over that one. There are also some requirements or guidelines in the Medical Board of Australia's Code of Conduct, similar to Medicare, but ensuring that records are accurate, up to date. Obviously, legibility is not a problem; it's all computer generated. That they're held securely. And so forth. I guess just one thing to think about, which can come up, is ensuring that records show respect. So I guess when records are or consultations are recorded verbatim, sometimes it picks up and records the banter between the clinician and the patient. And so sometimes it can record things the odd expletive or other word that might sort of crop up in a consultation that is harmless, it isn't intended to offend, but is then in black and white. So again, just another reason to check the record to make sure that they also meet the board's requirements for good medical records. So yeah, just the last thing I was going to talk about was the TGA. So at the moment, the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, has some criteria around what software it can be defined as a medical device. And so currently, and I'm paraphrasing, but generally the kind of requirement at the moment is for software to be a medical device, it has to be used directly as a decision-making tool, so in diagnosis or treatment. So if AI is used to help the practitioner formulate a diagnosis, or if it's used to support a diagnostic test or used to think about differential diagnosis, then that would be defined as a medical device. Currently, generative AI tools that are used to generate medical records are not considered a medical device, and so therefore they don't have to be registered with the TGA, and therefore essentially this means that currently it's an unregulated market. So I think that for me is just another reason to think about, if you're still pre-contemplative and not sure whether this is something that you want to use in your practice or not. Just another reason to think about ensuring that you understand all of the medico-legal issues, but also testing and trialing them out beforehand, just so that you can see for yourself how they work, how well they work, or perhaps what their limitations are, so that you then go into any decision fully informed before subscribing. And it's definitely not a reason, to not use these tools, because I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, and as Professor Wu has so eloquently and articulately demonstrated, they do have the real potential to, make our lives easier and to improve the care that we can provide to patients. So I think, in summary, I think for me the take-home messages are that AI is already here, and I think will continue to fundamentally transform practice. Sorry, I didn't mean general practice. I meant clinical practice in general. And also, as I've said, any decision about whether to use AI should be based on an informed understanding of not only the benefits but also the risks. And I think consent, privacy, data retention, but also checking accuracy are really the key sort of medico-legal issues to think about. So that's really all I wanted to say. And just perhaps a QR code here, just a link to some information, written information, that sort of summarizes the key points that I've made this evening. So that'll just take you to a link to the MIPS website, and an article that I've written on AI transcription tools. So I can see we've got about 14 minutes left, so I'll stop sharing my screen, and yeah, very happy to take any questions that we might have.
Thank you, Dr. Bradfield. Lovely. So we've got a few questions, and I'll just start from the earlier ones and go down. So can't quite remember if we covered it or not, but the first question is, given that the law is to keep clinical notes for 7 years, what is the best way around having to store every transcript for the 7 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess the first thing is understanding what jurisdiction you're in and whether in fact you have an obligation to keep records for 7 years. That would be the first thing. I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I guess on the one hand, if the law requires information to be kept for 7 years, then I guess it's very difficult to advise otherwise. But I think also, as I mentioned, having a look at what those transcripts contain as well. So thinking about what jurisdiction you're in, but also, is there identifiable information in the transcript? And I guess the other thing, and Professor Wu and I did sort of talk about this a couple of days ago, is there the option of cutting it out of the vendor software and pasting it into a note in the medical record? Perhaps Professor Wu might be able to talk about what some of the practical options might be, but I guess it's very difficult to give specific advice here about what you should do, other than be aware of what your legal obligations are. If you're concerned that the transcript contains identifiable health information that's not in the medical record, then you'll need to find a way potentially of retaining that information for the required statutory time period. Professor Will, I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, look, I've put a lot of thought into this, and I think it's a really difficult one because there are no absolutely clear-cut guidelines on how we best manage this. And I guess that I've sort of weighed up, the risks. Overall, I would say that the benefits of having this type of software in your surgical practice far outweighs any of the uncertainties or the potential negatives associated with it. So I'm absolutely sold on using this type of software. Now, all of the transcription, these types of software programs will create a text version of the of the conversation you've had with your patient. There's also an audio, theoretically, there's also an audio version, theoretically. Now, that's where it's a little bit unclear because you don't have access to that audio version. And and you don't even know if the software is actually maintaining it on their server if you choose not to have some sort of auto delete or manual delete from the system. But all of them do offer the opportunity to click a copy button, which will copy the text version of the transcript, which you could theoretically copy and then paste directly as an entry into Genie or any one of the sort of practice management software programs that we use as surgeons. And I guess to some extent, I'm a little concerned as to whether there's an enormous amount of text that is generated, whether we are going to start putting pressure on the server, and then I can't see us not ultimately being asked to pay for that. But even if that happened, I think it's still going to be a lot cheaper. The cost of running a practice is still going to be a lot less with these scribe programs than otherwise. So I made a conscious decision not to bother copying it because I thought that the quality of the clinical notes that the scribe program produces it's far better than I've ever had in my clinical practice. The important thing is to check it, of course, and to make sure it covers everything you've discussed. But it's phenomenal how the quality of the notes is just so much better than you could ever do by writing or typing it. So I've decided that the summary is, to me, is a complete record, and I'm prepared to, you could say, take a very minuscule risk of not keeping an entire health record for 7 years by deleting it off the server.
Thank you for that answer, team. We've got a few more questions coming in, and I would just like to note the participants. If there's any particular question that you would like answered, please go ahead and like preferred questions. But I'll just go to the next one, which is, as the PRS has criticised practitioners for inadequate note keeping despite using standardised performers, what guidance exists on how regulatory and determination authorities will perceive AI-generated notes in medical records? And are AI-generated notes clearly labelled as such?
I might just quickly start by, when I do put an entry into Genie, and you can do this with any of the software programs, I actually make a note that, for example, that this is an AI that I have received consent. So I've actually got a checkbox in Genie which I tick, and it's one of the sort of subheadings for that entry, which says that I've got consent for a Heidi AI transcript. So that's customizable and you can do it. I think it's worthwhile having that sort of entry. I also have a similar sort of checkbox which tells me that this was a telehealth consultation rather than a face-to-face.
Yeah, I might add, thanks for that. I think so. First of all, I've just put a link in the chat to AHPRA's current guidance around artificial intelligence in healthcare. It does have a section devoted to generative AI. I know the question was though around Medicare and Medicare Review and PSR. I think so. So for me, I think there's a distinction to be made between a template and an AI generated record. So I think where there's been criticism in the past, and I can't comment on any specific cases, where there's been criticism in the past around the use of templates is where Medicare or the PSR has a concern that what is in the template might not have actually happened. And so that can arise where they look at, they do an audit of many, many records, and they might see entries that are identical consult after consult after consult and across different records that they audit. And we're not just talking similar, but identical. And so that then raises a credibility concern for the PSR about whether the records accurately reflect what occurred. So that's an extreme example. I know sometimes the PSR makes a comment around the use of templates in passing, and it's often where a template might, exist that again calls into, so it's often around questions around the credibility of the record. I think where AI generated records is different is that given how the software works, it's recording what happened, creating a template, and then summarizing it into a progress note, if you like. And so, the chance, so already it's kind of a reflection of in real time what happened during that consultation. So, and because there's more detail and more information than perhaps there would be for records not generated by AI, I actually think that it adds credibility to the record rather than creates question marks over the credibility of a record, particularly when a clinician checks the accuracy of the record at the end of the consultation. So like I said at the beginning, I think human input into an AI output gives a much better result than either individually. And I think it's not just in relation to the completeness of the record, the speed with which it's created, but also the accuracy and the trustworthiness of the record as a record of what actually occurred during the consultation.
Lovely, thank you. The next question is that APRA has recently cancelled a medical practitioner's registration because he did not fill in information under all the headings in his electronic medical records. What legal resource do practitioners have in defence of this if the software does not fill in every category?
Yeah, I can take this one again if you like, and perhaps Henry, you might have some comments as well. I mean, I think again, very difficult to comment on specific cases. I mean, I think I would be sort of vigorously defending an allegation against a doctor that there's somehow an obligation to fill in on every occasion, every subheading for a progress note. I think a progress note is a note of what happened, and if it was a telephone call or if it was a very brief consultation or it was a consultation for a specific purpose that didn't require every subheading to be completed, then I don't think any regulator should reasonably expect all of those subheadings to be completed. So there may have been some further nuances with that case that I'm not aware of. I'm not sure what case is being cited. So just to say that there may be some additional complexities with that case that make it difficult to comment on. However, again, I think because the way generative AI works is that the consultation's recorded and a transcript is created, it's likely to be inherently more detailed and give an accurate representation of what occurred during the consultation. So again, I think it's sort of difficult to know how AI records will be perceived in the future by courts, tribunals, or regulators. But my suspicion is that because of the nature of them being generated in real time and being based on a recording of a consultation, it's likely that they will be, significant weight will be placed on them by courts, tribunals, and regulators, and they're likely to be more detailed than current records.
Yeah, I don't have a great deal to add to it, but my feeling is that irrespective that these AI-generated notes are going to actually provide you a lot more protection than than you would if you don't use them. In particular, I'm just amazed with the when I'm explaining the material risks associated with an operation. A lot of times I forget to actually write that down or type that. But this is prior to using Heidi, pre-Heidi, whereas the program's ability to list down all the material risks that you've mentioned. And the other thing which I really love about it is that sometimes we have tangents where you're explaining a risk and then you get waylaid and you start talking about something else, then you come back to it. And then Heidi's able to say, hey, that belongs to this discussion, and pulls it all together. And so I find that particularly useful. And also with I think there's a bit of common sense has to exist. For example, when I do a telehealth consultation, I can't fill out, I can't say they've done a physical examination. So, I think that's common sense that's a field that doesn't need to be completed.
Lovely, thank you. And on that note, it has just turned 7, so I would like to thank you both for your time this evening and talking about AI and transcription tools. I think it's very important information at the moment to talk about and discuss because it can be very useful. And I think, as Owen mentioned, a lot just being aware of the consequences and implications of it. Absolutely. So thank you both for your time. And if anyone has any further questions about this, feel free to get in touch with Rax or MIPS. And Owen, if you have anything to add, or Henry, Uh, Thank you.
I've
Thanks
got
very
just,
much.
oh, sorry, go on.
No, you go. Sorry,
Oh
Professor
yeah,
Wentworth.
look, I've got sort of one sort of shameless promotional comment is that some of you may be aware that I'm the convener for the RACS ASC in 2025, and we feel the organisers of this meeting feel that this is a really big ticket item, and to the extent that we're looking to have I guess opportunities for our surgeons to see how their software works in the trade hall, because it's I think even by May 2025 we're going to see a significant number of surgeons who will have embraced this as a tool.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I would add is that I think certainly in the last 9 months here at MIPS, we've seen a lot of calls to our advisory service from members who are thinking about using these tools or are already using these tools and have questions. So we know it's being used. We know it's out there. We know that there's a lot of practitioners using these tools. And so we're often asked, like, what's our position as an MDO? We don't have a view on whether practitioners should or shouldn't be using these tools. We can see immense benefit from using these tools. But like I said at the very beginning, I think the most important thing is for practitioners, surgeons to make their own decision about whether this is something that's right for them. Bearing in mind that, it is changing very rapidly and, I think it will be the way of the future, like it or not. But to make an informed decision and to lean into the advice and expertise that your MDO can provide in sort of helping to guide you through some of the questions that you might have. So that was all I wanted to say, and just thank you for the opportunity to speak.